Fascism didn't disappear. Unfortunately, it didn't actually die with the 20th century. It just changed medium. It traded uniforms for ring lights. It traded propaganda posters for YouTube thumbnails. Today I want to talk about fascism, and I want to use the theory of Wilhelm Reich to do so. Wilhelm Reich argued that fascism is not a political ideology. He argued that it's an emotional structure, a way of organizing things like fear, anxiety, desire, and repression into this worldview that feels comforting and maybe even righteous. Once you really understand what I'm about to get into, I think it's going to really help you understand the modern right, especially modern right-wing creators. Because what we're seeing online today, from hypermasculine influencers to purity-obsessed critics, from binary enforcing pundits to strong leader cults, none of this is just strictly political. This video is not about left versus right. It's about the emotional architecture behind authoritarian thinking. It's about why certain messages feel so powerful, so intoxicating, and so familiar, even when they're built on fear of freedom, fear of ambiguity, and fear of our own desires. So today we're going to take Wilhelm Reich's analysis and bring it into 2025. We're going to look at how these theories, these concepts show up in modern right-wing content. We're going to see that a lot of them rely on the same dynamics that were described by Wilhelm Reich about what was going on in the 1930s. Because Reich's claim was simple. Authoritarianism doesn't rise because people love authority. It rises because people are absolutely terrified of dealing with themselves. So this is Unspooked, and today we are going to unmask the collective unconscious of the modern right. Let me tell you a little bit about his theory, just a really quick, recap of what he was talking about. Wilhelm Reich wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism in 1933. This was around a time when authoritarianism was on the rise in Germany. And his argument was very radical at the time. Well, it's still radical now, actually. He said fascism is not an ideology, it's a character, it's a psychological structure, it's a pattern of emotional responses. It's a way of relating to the world when freedom feels overwhelming and ambiguity feels dangerous. So let's break down this model into 5 pieces. And I promise you, once you recognize them, you're gonna see them everywhere. Reich believed that authoritarianism doesn't start in politics, it starts in childhood. It begins with rigid family structures. Parents who demand obedience, not understanding. Parents who teach conformity rather than understanding. Parents who teach that conformity is safety. And parents who enforce hierarchy as natural and moral and unquestionable. Reich argued that this creates a personality type which craves authority later in life, not because they're weak, but because freedom feels too unsafe, too unstable. So this authoritarian personality wants someone else to create the structures that it doesn't trust itself with. It wants someone else to establish order, to draw boundaries, and to define rules. Because freedom is too open, it's too undefined, it's too full of responsibility. So they look for this strong authority to kind of calm their own inner chaos. The second layer to this is sexual repression. This is Reich's most controversial claim. If you repress desire, you produce rage. He believed that authoritarian movements always target sexuality first, because sexual autonomy threatens rigid social structures. When desire is repressed through religious guilt or through moral shame, that energy that was repressed, it doesn't disappear. It turns inward. It becomes frustration. And eventually, this turns into aggression. He wrote something like, fascism feeds on the emotional byproducts of repression: anger, resentment, contempt, bitterness, and envy. Because what can't be expressed can be weaponized. Now, another aspect of this is the fear of ambiguity. Ambiguity is overwhelming. Complexity feels like chaos, and, nuance can be a threat. So the authoritarian personality collapses the world into binaries. Order versus chaos, men versus women, purity versus degeneracy, normal versus abnormal, us versus them. And Reich says that this is not political ideology. He says this is a coping mechanism because simple categories protect the psyche from internal contradictions. Ambiguity is terrifying because ambiguity demands self-reflection. It demands agency, choice. It demands responsibility. So obviously it's easier to declare there's only two genders, period, no question, than to confront the inherent instability of identity. Reich also claimed that authoritarian movements survive through projection. Whatever the authoritarian can't accept in themselves, they have to locate in what is external to them or what is considered external to them. Their own resentment becomes degeneracy. Their rigidity becomes morality. Their confusion becomes leftist chaos. Their authoritarian tendencies becomes this idea of defending freedom. So projection turns this inner conflict into a political crusade. And Reich believed that this was the engine of fascist psychology, the constant externalization of one's own fears and desires into an external scapegoat. Lastly, he claimed that the authoritarian personality seeks a savior, someone who appears strong enough to bring order, someone who can tell them who they are clearly, someone who can tell them what to do, someone who will remove this horrifying burden, freedom. This is the emotional core of all authoritarian movements. The desire to surrender responsibility to a symbolic father figure. So Reich said that people don't submit to authoritarian leaders because they feel forced to. They submit because it feels like relief, because uncertainty is too exhausting, because freedom is too heavy, and because desire is confusing and ambiguity is too painful. So, like I said, Wilhelm Reich argued that one of the number one things that authoritarian governments or authoritarian leaders or figures do is they try to regulate sexuality. And not because of morality and not because of religion or whatever they use to justify or rationalize what they're doing. They do it because they feel internally that the hierarchies that they understand are being broken down. And modern right-wing media proves this constantly. Let's talk about Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate presents himself as hypermasculine, unbeatable, dominant, invulnerable, and sexually powerful. And from a Reichian perspective, this is not strength, it's like armor. He repeatedly suggests that women are most happy when they obey men, that male authority is natural, that female independence destabilizes society, and that men have to control the household. This obsession with control reveals what Reich described as the compensatory authoritarian character. This is a persona that's built on the fear of internal chaos. Tate frames desire as war, and he frames intimacy as hierarchy, and he frames masculinity as domination, because ambiguity, like emotional, sexual, relational, whatever, is too dangerous. He's a pussy. For Reich, this kind of overcompensation is the psychological raw material of fascism. Rigidity standing in for stability, domination standing in for desire. What about Matt Walsh? Matt Walsh is absolutely terrified of gender ambiguity. His entire career circles around one question: what is a woman? And his panic about this question is being sold as a political thing. But this is not political. This is psychological. He repeatedly argues that gender diversity is chaos, that non-binary identity is insanity, that trans people are a threat to society, that ambiguity is a danger to children, and that traditional gender gender is the foundation of order. But I think Reich would say that what Walsh is doing here is he's not defending society, he's defending his psychic order. Gender ambiguity very much fractures a worldview that is structured around clear binaries and stable identities and predictable roles and unquestioned hierarchy. So ambiguity creates this horrifying anxiety that he just can't handle. So it has to be controlled, it has to be punished, it has to be eliminated. What about Tradwife influencers? Tradwife influencers promote submission, homemaking, right? Male authority, and this kind of return to biblical authority, biblical femininity as a role. And this is often framed as empowering somehow. But again, from a Reichian perspective, this is simply a reaction to freedom. Essentially, Tradwife influencers claim the same thing that Andrew Tate claims. Women are happier, or they were happier when they would subordinate. Family hierarchy is somehow divine. It's somehow above what we're doing now. Female desire is dangerous, and autonomy leads to unhappiness, so returning to the past will somehow restore this order. Reich argued that patriarchal family structures are like a breeding ground for authoritarian personalities. You learn hierarchy at home and you bring it to society. So Tradwife ideology is not nostalgia. It's a psychological strategy to avoid responsibility and complexity by retreating into a fantasy of returning to order. One of the most consistent themes among right-wing creators, from Shapiro to Peterson to Walsh to various masculinity podcasters, is the fear of degeneracy. They constantly talk about OnlyFans. They constantly talk about queer visibility. They constantly talk about polyamory. They talk about kink. They talk about dating apps. The definition, it shifts constantly because they are not rational about it. They're emotional about it. Reich said that repressed desire becomes like a moral panic. The authoritarian personality can't integrate desire, so it declares desire immoral and punishes others for expressing it. This is why right-wing creators constantly talk about decay, immorality, and degenerate culture, even as their own audience is known to consume sexual content. Because the repression creates obsession, and then obsession becomes political rhetoric. Here's what Reich said. He said that authoritarian movements always target sexuality first because sexual freedom empowers individuals. Erotic energy disrupts control. Gender fluidity disturbs hierarchy. Pleasure resists authority. And desire makes people unpredictable. But authoritarian psychology requires the opposite of that. It requires predictability, roles, binaries, hierarchy, and obedience. And sexual liberation destroys this. It destabilizes all of that. So in a way, sexual autonomy is political autonomy. Queer visibility is symbolic revolt, and allowing ambiguity threatens a rigid psyche. Now that we look at the most important aspect, which is sexual repression, let's look at the aspect of moral purity. Why do creators like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, whoever else rely so heavily on stories of decay, degeneracy, contamination, and societal collapse? So Wilhelm Reich argued that once sexual repression produces fear and internal conflict, the fear has to go somewhere, right? It doesn't disappear. It needs a story. It needs some kind of a narrative that explains anxiety and offers a solution. And for the authoritarian personality, that solution is almost always purity of some kind. Moral purity, cultural purity, national purity, purity as security. And come on, in the modern right-wing ecosystem, this is everywhere. Peterson's worldview seems almost elegant on the surface, but it's exactly built on what Wilhelm Reich called the fascist emotional architecture. His core claims include something like like chaos is feminine, order is masculine. Hierarchy is natural and necessary. Tradition protects us from collapse. Too much freedom leads to disintegration. Culture is falling apart because people are refusing to follow rules. And this is Reich 101. People who fear ambiguity turn life into a moral drama. Order must be defended. Chaos must be contained. When Peterson speaks about the West collapsing, or the chaos of postmodernism, or the dangers of questioning identity categories, he isn't doing political analysis. He's doing moral hygiene work. He's policing the borders of the psyche that can't tolerate instability. I think of Shapiro as the high priest of degenerate culture. Shapiro's rhetoric is built on one single binary: moral people versus degenerates. Examples from his content are as follows. The left is destroying Western civilization. Modern culture is corrupt. Traditional values are the only path to stability. People who question gender are mentally ill. Radical leftists are trying to indoctrinate our children. And these are not political arguments. They're purity arguments. And Reich's framework explains this perfectly. If you repress desire, you become moralistic. If you fear ambiguity, you turn complexity into contamination. And if you're anxious about your inner world, you will project that onto the outer world, onto society. Shapiro's concept of degeneracy functions as a container for everything that makes him and his audience uncomfortable. So morality becomes a disinfectant. Now what about Tucker Carlson? Carlson's storytelling is almost ritualistic. America's collapsing, everything used to be better, modern culture is corrupting children, and we have to restore things, right? That's always what he's talking about. And this is textbook Reich, okay? Purity versus decay is the central myth of the authoritarian personality. And nostalgia is the fantasy of returning to some kind of state of purity, some kind of state of non-complexity, before diversity, before ambiguity, before contamination. When Carlson fixates on demographic change, he's expressing a Reichian anxiety, the fear that identity categories that make sense to him are dissolving. So in a way, purity panic is the emotional substrate of most far-right storytelling. But why does this work so well? Why does it work so well in right-wing media? Reich believed that people cling to purity narratives because it allows them to avoid their own inner conflict. So you don't have to face your own desire, your own resentments, your own contradictions, and your own fear of freedom. You can simply declare, I'm good, they're evil. I'm pure, they're degenerate. I am order, they are chaos. So purity narratives obviously protect the psyche from that fear of ambiguity. But it does so at the cost of empathy, nuance, and freedom. And this is why right-wing creators often sound more like pastors than analysts. They are offering spiritual clarity in a world that feels psychologically unstable. When a culture becomes organized around purity, dissent becomes contamination, minorities become threats, difference becomes danger, change becomes decay, and complexity becomes chaos. And Reich argued that this is how fascism works, how it takes root, not through logic, but through the promise of emotional safety. And modern right-wing media delivers this on demand. Every narrative says the same thing. You don't have to face your inner contradictions. Someone else already told you who the enemy is. Now we have to talk about projection. This is kind of where the rhetoric of they comes in. And it's where modern right-wing movements start to resemble the exact patterns that Reich witnessed nearly a century ago. Wilhelm Reich believed that the authoritarian personality survives through one core mechanism: projection. Whatever they can't face in themselves, fear, confusion, desire, whatever, they externalize it into an external scapegoat, a political enemy. This enemy becomes the source of all uncertainty, all chaos. And modern right-wing politics is built almost entirely on this psychological trick. Let's talk about the man, Donald Trump. Trump is one of the clearest examples of this projection. When Trump says they're trying to steal our country, or they're coming here to hurt us, or they hate you, or only I can fix this, or the others are corrupt, or disloyal, or weak, or immigrants are bringing crime, he's projecting an internal instability outward. He is transforming personal chaos into collective fear. Reich argued that authoritarian leaders rely on projection because they can't confront their own vulnerability. They have to constantly maintain this search for political enemies or external enemies to maintain their psychological stability. And they depend on followers who need the same thing. Trump has perfected this. He took this anxiety and he turned it into a literal battleground. It's always like, my suffering isn't my suffering. It exists because of them, and eliminating them will help me fix it. And them is nobody. It's just whoever the movement needs to survive. Ron DeSantis is a good example here. DeSantis' legislative agenda is like a Reichian case study. He attacks LGBTQ visibility. He wants to control school curricula. He wants to ban books. He wants to restrict discussions on race and identity. He wants to reframe these issues as moral threats. This is not policy. This is projection of ambiguity anxiety onto vulnerable groups. Reich argued that authoritarian personalities cannot tolerate ambiguity because ambiguity forces self-reflection. And DeSantis' anti-woke agenda was very much a psychological campaign, not a political one. The message was, everything that is unclear is dangerous. Everything that's different is dangerous. So these laws are not about protecting children. They're about protecting adults from their own complexity. Italy's Prime Minister, Meloni, uses classic Reichian projection. Europe is under attack. Our identity is being erased. We have to defend our national identity. We have to defend the natural family. This rhetoric channels internal insecurity into cultural panic. Reich argued that when societies feel uncertain, leaders often create purity myths. So the pure nation, the pure family, the pure past. This is the same with Viktor Orban. He does the same thing. He constantly frames immigrants as an existential threat. They're gonna replace us, right? They're gonna destroy our culture. We have to protect our life. But immigrants are never the actual issue. Differences. He uses immigrants as the embodiment of internal chaos, projection of Hungary's insecurities about modernization, globalization, and its identity within all of that. Reich would say, authoritarian leaders don't fear outsiders. They fear the collapse of their own internal order, and therefore turn outsiders into symbols of that fear. One of the strongest proofs of Reich's theory is the obsessive targeting of LGBTQ people. Right-wing creators and politicians often claim trans people are grooming children, queer identity destroys society, and non-binary people are mentally ill. This is projection in its purest form. Ambiguity in gender mirrors the ambiguity within oneself. Reich argued that authoritarian personalities externalize their own sexual anxiety onto marginalized groups. The more fluid that an identity becomes, the more anxious they feel, and the more violently they're willing to defend these rigid categories. So this isn't about morality. This is about psychological self-preservation. Across the right, immigration is not framed as a political issue. It's framed as contamination. Reich said that movements obsessed with contamination are always projecting internal weaknesses onto external groups. So immigrants become symbolic vessels for things like economic anxiety, identity confusion, loss of control, and repressed aggression. So the authoritarian psyche needs an external other to stabilize its fragile sense of self. Reich claimed that the authoritarian character never said, I am angry, I am insecure, I am confused, and I am afraid. Instead, they project. They say, they are destroying my country. They are corrupt. they are dangerous. They are the problem. So projection turns this psychological conflict into a political conflict so that they don't have to face their own vulnerabilities. It creates enemies where there are none. It converts desire into disgust and fear into hatred. And that hatred becomes the emotional glue that holds authoritarian movements together. This is where psychology becomes politics, and obedience becomes relief from freedom, relief from inner responsibility. So, Wilhelm Reich argued that authoritarian movements don't rise because people love tyranny. They rise because people are afraid of freedom. Because freedom means responsibility, and responsibility means ambiguity, and ambiguity means facing the self. So instead, the authoritarian psyche seeks a figure that can give them relief, that can remove that burden. Someone who embodies order, certainty, and stability. So, a symbolic father, a savior, a protector, a punisher, a man so strong that he makes that fear irrelevant. Trump's movement does not function like a political coalition. It functions like a family. His supporters don't just agree with him, they identify with him. Their sense of strength and righteousness is tied to his persona. Reich argued that the authoritarian character wants a father who tells them who the enemy is, a father who clarifies what is right and wrong, a father who punishes the outsider, a father who absolves them from their own responsibility. So Trump's appeal is in no way intellectual, it's emotional. He gives people permission not to think. So now we have the rise of strongman leaders. The rise of strongman leaders across the world follows the same psychological script. I will protect you, I will defend tradition, I will restore order, and I alone can fix this. So the authoritarian psyche hears these promises not as political statements, but as emotional relief. And Reich believed that when a society is overwhelmed by ambiguity, through economics or culture or sexual problems or psychological issues, the need for a father increases. People surrender autonomy because it feels good, not because they're forced to. So obedience is soothing, dependence is comforting, submission is safe, and authority is an anesthetic.